Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this event at the Festival of Economia of Trento. We have our guest today, Orley Aschenfelter, who is one of the most prominent economists from Princeton University in New Jersey, one of the top American universities, and he specialized in a number of economic areas, mainly relevant to law, labor, and relating subjects. He was the director of the American Economic Review and a member of a number of economic associations, and again is one of the most prominent American economists. But if I may add a personal note, what makes him very, very nice is that he's an expert in wine. He actually created an index to evaluate the quality of French wine using econometric parameter, considering the dryness of the air and the humidity of the soil and so on and so forth. He's currently the chairman of the American Wine Association. So it's not just entrenched in the ivory tower of economists, but it's part of the real life. Today we'll be talking about a very interesting topic, that is to say the evaluation of a purchasing power. He carried out a study based on the wages paid to McDonald's crew. McDonald, as you know, is a multinational group par excellence that operates in more than 70 countries. I believe the 70 countries are the countries that were taken into consideration in the study. And on these grounds, Professor Aschenfelter considered, first of all, the wage rate paid to the people around the world by McDonald's and the impact on the national health systems. Well, in a number of countries, as you know, there's no national health system. People have to provide for their own health insurance. McDonald is used to be involved in international indexes. You might be familiar with the Big Mac index evaluated by The Economist every year. And this is something different. It's the cost of Big Mac. It's also called the Burgonomics, actually. So it's the cost of Big Mac, which is the same around the world, though it has been priced differently in the various countries. And on the grounds of the McDonald price, the purchasing power of a certain currency calculated, of course not officially. I happened to read in The Economist recently that the latest Mac index is the following: $5.6 in the US, $2.83 in China, which means that the yuan is undervaluated by 44% at the current exchange rate. So what, you may say? Well, this is an interesting way to understand the real purchasing power of a currency based on a tradable good, that is hamburger in this specific case, using the different currencies. But going back to Professor Aschenfelter, he will be talking about real wages. This has nothing to do with Big Mac index, of course, but Professor Aschenfelter has evaluated the wages paid to McDonald's crew and has drawn a number of interesting conclusions that we'll be hearing now. I can tell you that we decided to have the contribution by the professor and a short Q&A session to take also the questions from the floor. And then we'll be resuming with the second part of the presentation, and we will draw in conclusions at the end.
So I have the prerogative of the speaker. There seem to be two chairs here that are not being used. If it's permissible, perhaps someone wants to take I'd rather sit in a chair myself. Maybe you can take that chair, if you'd like it. Someone who's, no, this person's standing back here. There's a seat there. I know it's reserved, but no one's here, so I would say until they come, there you go. Perfect. The best seat in the house. I hope I don't make you hungry. I'm glad you already had lunch. because I might make you hungry. I put this deliberately, that's called a full meal in some languages. I put that in very small so you would not be tempted to worry about it. Let me start just by saying why we want to study a real wage. A real wage is the amount of consumption good that you can obtain by working for an hour. So if you want to think about it as an algebraic matter, I'm going to use dollars. It's the dollars per hour divided by the dollars of some good, which means when you divide, you get the number of goods that you earn per hour. So in that way, if the goods can be made comparable in all places at all times, we can make comparisons over all times and across all places. But in order for that to be true, we need the work the person does to be exactly the same, and we need the good to be exactly the same. That's how I came, as I will show you, to think that this giant conglomerate, McDonald's, which receives much more of its revenue outside the United States than in, by standardizing things, provided a measurement tool for us. Why do we want to know this? Well, first of all, it allows us to compare, and I'll show you how, living standards over time and across places. In principle, it provides a universal measure. It also allows us to measure the effects of economic changes, reforms in some countries, maybe setbacks in other countries. So it gives us an independent way to measure that. Now, that's not to say that the price of a Big Mac cannot be manipulated by a government that desires to do that. But so long as it doesn't happen, we have an independent valuation. That's how I came to think about this. Finally, one of the most interesting things about the wage rate is that it's also a measure of productivity. Generally speaking, the more productive a country is for people doing exactly the same thing, the higher the wage will be. So if someone who works at a McDonald's makes more money in Italy than they do in China, which I can assure you they do, that must be because Italy is a more productive economy. There's no other difference between them. That's a study of total factor productivity, and the real wage is one way, I'll show you more about this, is one way to get at that measurement. Now let me give you a small outline of the talk, a little history about real wages. The study of real wages goes back a long way, and the reason is because it's one of the few economic measurements that we can use that has been used for hundreds of thousands of years. For example, Diocletian, the Roman emperor, provided some of the earliest information we have on wages and prices because he engaged in something that Richard Nixon also engaged in, which was wage and price controls. In order to establish wage and price controls, he had to set up what would be the maximum wage and what would be the maximum price for many different products. So we actually have measures that go back. There's a very lively debate right now about what the real wage was in the Roman Empire. So you can study these things much more with much more care, far more convincingly than you can think about gross national product in 500. It doesn't make much sense. Secondly, I'm going to do a little bit of economic theory. So there's a little bit of heavy lifting. You need to concentrate a little bit at the beginning so you'll understand exactly what I'm trying to measure and how you should interpret it. Then I'm going to show you results in the USA. And I have actually a new project, brand new data that I will show you has never been revealed before, which provides information across the whole United States. We've actually collected data on the wage rate at McDonald's in over 13,000 stores. So I have many thousands of observations in the U.S. Then we'll break, and at that point we can have questions, and then I'll turn to an analysis of the rest of the world and some other things you might want to do with this set of data. Let me start with an example which was given to me by a man named Bob Allen. It's a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to help you. If you have good eyes, you can probably see it. This is a comparison in 1704 of Canton and London. And it demonstrates 2 points. One, it demonstrates that the construction of a price index is complex because it depends on what it is that people consume in the two places that you're going to compare. So in the first column, there are for many things that would have been considered necessities. The ratio of the price in England to the price in China, Canton is about where Hong Kong is now. So this is like London versus Hong Kong. Starch, by the way, has to be different because starch is bread in England, but it's rice in China. And then there's meat, milk, and so on. As you go down the list, you'll see this is the price in England compared to China. Prices are much higher. Incidentally, they're measured in pieces of silver. That was the coin of the world in 1700, little pieces of silver. So they're measured in pieces of silver, and you'll see at the bottom, but it looks like the English prices are higher. All the ratios, with a few exceptions, like milk, where milk is relatively cheap in England compared to China. Everything else, except for charcoal, is more expensive in England. At the bottom, I show you the relative wage rate of an ordinary common laborer. You'll see that the English wage rate is about 3.6 times higher, 3.6 the ratio of the wage rate in China. So the English workers made more money. But you can see right away they also paid much higher prices for the things they bought. Now, in order to construct a comparison, we need to have a weight. How much did they spend on each of these things? So what's in the middle column is the English budget share, how much was spent on each of these products. And in the third column is the Chinese budget share. It'll be no surprise to most economists, the things that are relatively expensive in England are things that they consume less of. So starch is much more expensive, relatively, than other goods in England, and you can see the budget share in China on starch is higher than it is in England. Milk is exactly the reverse. Chinese drank virtually no milk, English consumed a lot of milk. This is an inevitable product of the fact that the relative prices are different. So which budget share should I use? If I use the English budget shares, I get a price index at the bottom of 3, consumer price index. The English prices are 3 times as high as Chinese prices, and if I divide that into the wage to get the real wage, I get 1.2 something, about 20% higher wage in England than it is in China. But if I use the Chinese budget shares, or the Chinese have now optimized themselves, the price index, the relative prices in England are more than 4 times as high, almost 5 times as high as they are in China. And if I divide that same relative wage, I find out that the English actually make 75% as much as the Chinese. Now, a normal way to deal with this is an extreme example, but it's one I want you to be aware of. A normal way to deal with this would be to take an average. An average says they made about the same. Real wage in Hong Kong and in London, virtually the same in 1700. In fact, I'll show you, generally speaking, real wages were the same everywhere in 1700. There were no differences across the world. Most people lived, for those of you who remember Ricardo and Malthus, they wrote a theory, basically, of how it was that wages would always be at subsistence. Well, they were not ignorant. They knew that wages had always been at subsistence. The theory came from the facts, not the other way around. By the time that they wrote their theory down, of course, it was wrong. Typical of economics, you should make your theories in advance, not after you know the facts. In any event, let me show you one more little piece of history and I'll finish. This is one of my favorite examples because it involves 2 famous labor economists. One was my teacher, Albert Rees. The other one was Paul Douglas. Paul, if anybody is an economist, you've probably heard of the Cobb-Douglas production function. That's Mr. Douglas. Douglas, a remarkable man, was a professor at the University of Chicago, and during the Second World War, he enlisted and served time in the Japanese theater. He came back and became a senator from the state of Illinois. So he ended up as a senator. He had constructed, from the period 1890 to 1914, Douglas had used his own money to construct an index of real wages in the United States. 1890 to 1914 is a quite important period in economic history. 1914 is the origin of the First Great War. The Americans did not come into that until later, but many economic historians treat that as sort of the end of normal times. 1890 to 1914 is a period of what we would hope would have been industrialization and rapid growth in the U.S. Now, Douglas and Rees, Douglas started and made up his index. Rees came along, that's the blue line, and you can see nominal wages, which are very low, by the way, about maybe 20 cents an hour, very, very low, no, but going up, nominal wages increasing. Rees decided that there was something wrong with what Douglas had done, and let me show you why he thought that. Douglas's green line is an index of prices, and Douglas's index of prices, as you can see, is also increasing dramatically. So that if you look at the red line in this graph, that's the real wage rate as measured by Douglas. It's flat. There is no progress in the United States, according to Douglas, between 1890 and 1914. Rees did not believe that could be true. So he went back and reconstructed all the work that Douglas had done, adding new sources. The new source that raised the wage, you can see it doesn't change the relationship, was using not just union contracts, but also other measures of wage rates. And that didn't change things much. But what really changed things was prices. Douglas has prices increasing, the green line, very rapidly in this period. Rees does not. What's the difference? Well, Rees hit upon what I consider to be, in retrospect, a brilliant idea. He used, as a way to collect data on prices of identical items, the internet of 1890. Now, you did not know there was an internet in 1890. There was, exactly like Amazon. It was called Sears Roebuck. It was called Montgomery Ward. And what they were is gigantic catalogs, thick, like this, that came to every house. In those catalogs, everything you would want to buy is there. You could buy a house. I remember them. I'm old enough. I remember them when I was a child. They sent these catalogs just before Christmas. Smart. Just a little before Christmas. And I looked at the toys. Toys, 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 toys. Begged my parents for the toys. The little crystal radio. I don't know if you've ever seen a crystal radio. I begged for the crystal radio. I did get the crystal radio. I was very happy. Thinking that in the middle of this, I lived in North Dakota at that time, which is in the middle of nowhere, I could get a radio signal. Of course, I couldn't, but I tried my best. So he used those catalogs over the period 1890 to 1914 to create a price index where you could use the same items year after year. And he could take account of the fact, unlike Douglas, who had used mainly commodity prices, that there was a huge introduction of manufactured goods, which in fact did not increase very much in price, just as we've seen today where many, many things that are easy to manufacture have become incredibly inexpensive. I just want to make one last point. So Rees's real wage index is the blue line here, and you can see the real wage grows. So the amendment is, yes, during industrialization, real wages were growing in the U.S., probably as they were in many places. The other thing I want you to look at is the yellow line. The yellow line, this is also something most young people don't know. Historically, when people were working at subsistence, which most people did throughout all of history, it was normal, the work hours were sunup to sundown every day but Sunday. That was the normal. And even in 1890, the normal work hours were 60 per week. You work 6 days a week for 10 hours. You can see this yellow line is declining over this period, 1890 to 1914, down to 55 hours per week. Basically means they went over more or less to half day of work on Saturday. One of the sure signs that a country's real wage is growing is that hours at work are declining. Leisure is a superior good. It's a good that you want more of. And if you get richer, it will be the case that you'll take more time in leisure. So people today think they work so hard, they don't work so hard. Nobody's working 60 hours. Well, maybe a few graduate students here at Trento, but otherwise, no, I don't think so. Let me just finish with this story about when the takeoff took place. This is a composite real wage rate measure for many places: Japan, Canton, Beijing, Delhi, and so on, Florence, an Italian one. And it shows you the percent by which the real wage exceeded subsistence. There's a measure of this, basic bare-bones subsistence. And you can see in 1914, most countries were still quite poor, including Italy. The countries that were rich were the English, the Dutch, and the Americans in this chart. Japanese were not. The Japanese economic miracle took place after the Second World War. When they entered the Second World War, they had no chance against the firepower of a country as large and as well off as the U.S. So now what you can see, many of these countries, things have changed. Japan is now more or less the same as all the developed countries. Italy is more or less the same as all developed countries. Beijing is not yet there, but it's growing, quite a ways below. Canton, Hong Kong, is much higher. Mexico City has not grown very much. Colombia has not grown very much. So what we've observed is some countries have managed to grow. Many have not. And I think the long-term goal for economic civilization is that everyone should be at that level of development, which I'll show you in a few minutes, equals 2 Big Macs per hour. Now let me take a little second to do a little heavy lifting theory. There are 2 ways to think about a real wage measure. One is to think of it as how much do I need today to be as well off as I would be in some other country or in some base period. So what I think of is some W star that tells me, because prices may have changed, how well off I need to be today, what wage I need today to be as well off as some other country or in some other time. And then what I do is I compare the actual wage rate to that wage rate you need in order to be well off. A typical, if it's the only thing that changes is prices, then you can compare wages to some price index. Notice this interpretation of the real wage rate is not affected by the failure of competition in the product market or the failure of competition in the labor market or the existence of minimum wages. If there are minimum wages and they raise the wage, then yes, the real wage went up. This is a measure really of worker welfare. But there's a second measure, second way to think about the real. Oh, I want to talk about one other thing. This is the most important point, takeaway that most people don't know. Tradable and non-tradable goods. This is, I'm going to try to describe to you this Balassa-Samuelson theorem. The basic idea is this. Some goods, like the iPhones you all have, are tradable. Some goods, like the meal you had at lunch, parts of it are tradable, but parts are not. A haircut. Everybody here has, I need a haircut, by the way, if you could find a barber. Haircuts are not tradable. A Big Mac is an interesting example of something. And I'm going to use it as an example because I'm going to use it. A Big Mac is a quasi-tradable. Much of what goes into a Big Mac is tradable. The bun, the meat, so on. The equipment, it's tradable. There's one part of the Big Mac that is not tradable, and that's the worker. So there's 2 components to the Big Mac. One is local, and it's produced by the local worker, and the other is tradable. Now, when we think about comparing people in different places, we need to think about comparing them not using iPhones. So if we measure wages in iPhones, the Chinese are abjectly poor. But if you think about measuring real wages in haircuts, they're very rich. What we really want is something in between, and that's what the Big Mac is. It's a quasi-tradable. Part of it is tradable and part of it is not. As I'll show you, a Big Mac is about half the price in China as it is here. This has nothing to do with exchange rates. The tradable goods, which is not what a Big Mac is, the tradable goods prices are more or less the same. The only thing that exchange rates are designed to do is to make tradable goods the same price. They don't make non-tradable goods the same price. So the Balassa-Samuelson or pin world table effect is one that implies that the real exchange rate will grow as the country is developed. The basic concept is countries differ in the productivity of the production of tradable goods. Some countries are good at producing tradable goods and others are not. Poor countries generally are the ones that they're not efficient at producing tradable goods. If you think of Norway or Sweden, efficient at tradable goods. Europe, mostly efficient at tradable goods. India, China, not. So what happens is, as the efficiency in the tradable goods sector grows, the country will grow. But wage rates have to be the same in both sectors. So the productivity of people in the tradable goods sector determine wage rates in both the tradable goods and the non-tradable goods sector. So it's very important to think about it, because when I talk to you about the wage rate at McDonald's measured in dollars, which I can do in all places because of exchange rates, that tells you how much that wage rate is measured in tradable goods. But if I then ask you, well, let's measure it in Big Macs, that tells you how much workers, how well off they are in a quasi-tradable, in sort of in a purchasing power sense. These are two completely different notions of what we want to think about as a real wage. One is about productivity, and the other one is about how well off the workers are. Okay, and I think that's enough. Let me say, this is basically, I told you this. The usual way of thinking about it is the real wage is proportional to marginal product of labor. And if you think of total factor productivity is what makes countries, the free lunch, it's the thing that makes a country more productive but doesn't require any more inputs. It's about productive efficiency in a much more general sense than just a measure of capital. It's efficiency in a far more general sense. And we know countries differ in those ways because we know that wage rates differ for workers that do exactly the same thing. And they shouldn't if there were not total factor productivity differences. So that's the way I'm going to think about the real wage. The wage measured in dollars, I'm going to think of that as an index of total factor productivity for a country. And I'm going to show you, by the way, that the McDonald's wage matches many other measures of total factor productivity. So it's a testable proposition. It wouldn't have to be true, but it is true. Independent measures of total factor productivity look just like the wage rate at McDonald's. And then I'm going to show you some measures of how well off people are, in which I'm going to be using Big Macs per hour. And I'll show you some other measures of other wage rates to show you that there is really a wage rate in almost every country. Well, there's the product. Oh, it looks big now, doesn't it? I'm going too fast. Do that again. I'll try to be slower. So there's the product. This is the first place where I collected data on McDonald's. Do you know where it is? Yeah, it's India. The Big Mac is not made from this animal. You cannot eat these animals. But I went to that McDonald's, and I bought a Big Mac. And the reason I went was this. I was doing some consulting work, pro bono consulting work with McKinsey on productivity in India. And Indians love to argue about inequality. They love to talk about poverty. So at some point, could hardly stand it. And I said to a former student of mine who named Surjit Bala, an Indian, I asked him, well, look, do you have McDonald's? Yes, we have McDonald's. Okay. How much does someone who works at a McDonald's make? I don't know. Let's go find out. So we went out to this store. There is a picture. These are the full meals, by the way. So this is can you see the chicken Maharaja Mac? The Big Mac is called the Maharaja Mac in India. Perfectly sensible. And it's made from chicken. Actually, when I went there, this is a little bit later period, they made it out of lamb, which was really good. I thought it was one of the best Big Macs I ever had. You could probably tell from looking at me, I have eaten Big Macs. This is the price of a full meal. And that's my cash register receipt. I paid for this meal, and I got that receipt. That was in 2000. You can see it's right on there, July of 2000, and you can see my Indian friend is a vegetarian, so he had a vegetarian combo thing, something, I don't know what it was. I had a Maharaja Mac and a shake, which is my favorite thing, and then he had a Coke. And you can see I paid 52 rupees for my Maharaja Mac. Do you know how much I don't know what that would be in euros, but in dollars, rupees are about 40 to the dollar. So that's about $1.50 for a Big Mac. I will bet you that over here in Trento, where you can get there is a McDonald's here, I know. Over here in Trento, I'll bet you pay $4.50. So the Indian Big Mac is a very good deal. However, there is a problem. You cannot get the Indian Big Mac here. I would recommend it here, but you can't get it. So that's an example of a quasi-tradable. It gives you the idea of that. I show you this because that's how I got interested in collecting data. This is my favorite McDonald's in the world. Does anybody know where this is? It's in Prague. That's a listed building. And this is the man, Czech man, Stepan Ureta, who I've done much of this work with. Is it standing in front of our favorite McDonald's? I have to go back, like a pilgrimage. I have to go back every time and have a Big Mac and see how it looks. Why McWages? Well, first of all, the interesting thing about it is we use the entry-level basic crew pay. Skill inputs are identical. There's no change in the technology used to produce McDonald's. The hedonic job qualities are the same. You basically do the same job. I've been in India and China, U.S., everywhere. Things are more or less the same. There is a reason for this. They're in over 140 countries. So I've collected data in about 70. There's a reason why they do this the same way. I don't know if you know what it is. The origin of McDonald's and its growth is food safety. Food safety. The thing about McDonald's is that because their reputation is worldwide, they cannot permit anyone to violate food safety rules. So the reason that you might want to eat McDonald's in India is because, yes, you can drink the water. Yes, you can eat the food. You will not get sick. I'm here to tell you that. The same is true in China. When we arrived here, someone asked where we're staying in an Airbnb, can you drink the water? Sensible question. In half the world, you cannot drink the water. You can drink the water in all McDonald's. That means, by the way, that they have to filter all the water in poor countries, and they have to have generators, because most of the stuff that they use is frozen. This is all run through what's called their operations and training manual, super secret, where when they break into a new country, they take all the people, the ones that are going to be local, and they go to Hamburger University. Hamburger University is outside of Chicago. It uses 20 different languages in which people are taught how to do exactly what you're going to do all over the world. They are growing now very rapidly, especially in China. In fact, at this point, there are more McDonald's in China than there are in the U.S. Just to give you the scale of what this is like. But now remember, China, of course, is 5 times as big as the United States, so there may eventually be 5 times as many. They don't adjust technology generally. And by the way, the handbook tells you to not violate any local laws, but it does not tell you what to charge for a Big Mac, and it does not tell you what wage rate to pay. There are no rules about that. Local. You do whatever you want. How's the data collection work? We've collected data in 2007 for 64 to 66 countries. It depends. Iceland dropped out of our sample during the financial crisis. They couldn't afford to import the materials to make Big Macs, and they all went out of business. Venezuela has just gone out of business also. There are no Big Macs. There used to be Big Macs in Venezuela. They're now gone. We've collected 27 countries since 2000. So I have some data to show you over a long period, and then I have more data to show you over about a 10-year period. We collect the data, hourly wage of the crew member, price of a Big Mac. We collect data from the urban areas in most countries, and we concentrate on the correlation, the median and the average is about 0.99. We have regional data in some countries. Now we have it all over the U.S., but we have been collecting regional data in India, China for a long time. We've also collected data from Starbucks. I don't know if you have Starbucks. I couldn't find one. I really would like us. If there's a Starbucks in Trento, please email me. I don't need the Big Mac, but I could really use a venti coffee. And that's to show you, and I'll show you that, to show you that what's going on in the different countries is a wage rate. In other words, it's not like there's something special about McDonald's. We've done a lot of work on the reliability, and here's where I'm going to make you an offer that will be difficult for you to refuse. I do not have the wage rate or the price of a Big Mac for Trento. If you go to the Big Mac, to the McDonald's in Trento, I'm only going to do this for 5 people, and you're one of the first 5. You go to the Trento McDonald's, you have a Big Mac, anything else you want, Big Mac, you send me the bill, and I will reimburse you for your meal. You can find me online. I can see some people are going to leave someone may leave right now. Don't leave yet. Lock the doors. You have to do one more thing. You have to ask a crew member what the wage rate is. And then you write that on the back, give me the address of the store, and the date will be on the cash register receipt. You send it to me. You can find me very easily. Google me, Orley ASHENFELTER. It'll be in Princeton. And for the first 5 that I get, I will send you a reimbursement, either a mail order or maybe even cash. I don't know, whatever it is. I'm going to guess it'll cost me about, well, now that you can have anything you want. I would recommend a shake, fries, and a Big Mac. So that's probably going to cost me about $10. It's okay. I can afford that. And then I'll have one more data point, because in Italy, we only collect data from Milan and Rome. Okay. Now let's just remind ourselves of the wage rates. We're going to have a wage rate measured in a common currency. I'm going to use dollars. There's going to be a price of a Big Mac. I can put that into dollars. That's going to be the measure of a non-tradable. And then I'm going to also calculate, so I'm going to call the wage rate in dollars and call that the McWage. The Big Macs per hour is going to be the division of the wage rate in dollars by the price of a Big Mac in dollars. So it's going to be the number of Big Macs that you get for an hour of work. A couple of limitations. There are minimum wages in many countries like Denmark or France. And if they're not real minimum wages, they're industry standards. It's important to understand that from the point of view of the welfare of the worker, that still tells us how well off they are. But it does cause a problem for the measurement of productivity, because then the real wage is distorted off of what the productivity level would be measured from the production function. Secondly, the fast food price. There are occasionally signs that fast food prices are being manipulated. That does occur. Argentina is a famous example. Because the Economist collects data on Big Mac prices, it's very tempting to control the price of a Big Mac and make your exchange rate look like it's different from what it really is. So Argentina, apparently, the Big Mac price has in the past been controlled. They have to offer you a Big Mac, but they don't allow you to find out what the price is. They stick it like around the corner somewhere and discourage you from consuming it. So that also is an imperfection in the using it that way. Let me just show you a couple of things about reliability. This is the McWage. This is dollar wage against Starbucks wages. You can see the countries are labeled here. The poor countries are at the bottom. China has Starbucks, by the way, quite nice. Very good Wi-Fi. I suppose the Communist Party is looking at everything you do, but I wouldn't give them your credit card. But other than that, you can certainly send love to your friends. You can see that the wage rates line up perfectly. So people at Starbucks make more money than people at McDonald's, generally speaking, not always, but you can see they line up very nicely. So if the wage rate at McDonald's is higher in one country, the wage rate at Starbucks will be too. So this is, I think, convincing for almost everybody that there is a wage rate in the country. There is a sort of a wage rate for that minimum skill worker called that. This is a little different. This is Big Macs per hour versus coffee per hour. You could think of it as the Big Macs per hour versus a venti, that's what I use, per hour. It's not quite as close. For example, there's some extraordinarily high coffee per hour prices in the U.S. and the U.K., but most of the others lie right along the line. Here's an example of manufacturing wages. If you look at this part right down, is that working? Let's see. No. Well, the lower right part, those are the high minimum wage countries. So they have wage rates that are very high compared to manufacturing, and that's because they have minimum wages, and the manufacturing wage is the one that's set by the market. These are the ICP, this is the International Comparison Project. I do a lot of work with them now. This is where the poverty rate for the whole world comes from, the International Comparison Project. They develop purchasing power parity indices. In fact, they're going to use some of our data to do purchasing power parity measures inside the United States, and you can see they line up pretty well. That one is actually, I think it's for the component of the ICP, which is cleaners. This is for cooks. So you can see even in the poor countries, which they cover well, they're related. Now let me show you a little bit about the U.S., and then we'll take a break. What I'm going to show you next is quite extraordinary. Recently collected data, and it surprised me. Let me start with a map of our great nation. The darker the color, the higher the Big Macs per hour. You can see the picture. Oh, I turned it off. Oh, wait a minute. It must be this one. Yeah, there's the red dot. Okay, so you can see the picture. The band of real wages is to the west, the north, and the east. The middle is lower. And I was surprised, these Big Mac per hour differences are quite large. The highest is 2.4, the lowest is 1.6. Mississippi is the lowest. I think California is the highest. These are differences, 2.4 to 1.6. These are differences on the order of almost 3/4 of a Big Mac. They're a very substantial fraction. So we have, and so I think the way to think about this is, new estimates, the way to think about it is, the U.S. is just like the rest of the world. Some places are more productive in tradable goods manufacturing. They're better at tradable goods production. So if you think of California, movies, tradable good. Computers, tradable goods. Software, tradable goods. You think of Mississippi, well, you probably can't think of anything. They're not effective at any kind of tradable goods production. You think of Minnesota, that's the picture up there, by the way, the high wage one. It's all most like if you get a valve replacement, you're going to get a St. Jude's valve. It's all made there. Mayo Clinic is there. Many manufacturers of medical equipment are located in Minnesota. Very efficient place. I think the way to think about it is we just like, the difference is not as stark as between China and the U.S. Basically, some of these places are less productive than others. And because, now here's the part that's surprising, and it's because people are not mobile across state. They don't move. They should move. But because they don't move, real wage differences can persist over quite long periods. And as much as 1.6 to 2.4 is pretty remarkable. We can measure the wage rate really beautifully here. We've done the survey we do. For example, we take 500 stores and go back and do it again, see how highly correlated they are. Do a great job of measurement. Now, so this just gives you a general picture. Now, I should add one more thing. Where you see what appear to be anomalies, like this, there it is, that state up there, that's West Virginia. Now, West Virginia is a very poor state. Why do they have such a high wage? And the answer is they passed a minimum wage. Many of the states that have, another good example is Nebraska. And that's this place here. They actually passed a constitutional amendment. Minimum wages are extremely popular with Americans, but not with American politicians. So a typical example is the state I live in, New Jersey, where the legislature passed a minimum wage increase. The governor, who was a Republican, Chris Christie, wanted to run for president, show his Republican credentials, vetoed the law. They did not have 2/3 majority in both houses, so they put it up for a constitutional amendment. The minimum wage in New Jersey is in the New Jersey Constitution because the people voted for it. The legislators or the governor did not. And that happens in many parts of the U.S. Sometimes there's a city. Minimum wages are very popular. And Nebraska, for example, is a 100% red state. There's probably not 5 Democrats in that state. And they did exactly the same thing. Their legislature would not pass it because as a matter of ideology, minimum wages are bad. People wanted them. So the people took it in their own hands and voted either a change in the, usually they have an initiative. So some of these are exceptions. California typically is not. I mean, they do have a minimum wage, but most wages are higher than that. Now let me show you something more remarkable. This is the exact same data set, except now it's broken down by county. So these are 8,000 counties in the United States. If there's no color, that means there's no McDonald's. So in the vast center, there are places, especially in the Dakotas, up here, the white that you see, that there's nothing there. There are also no people there, so not much going on. So I can't measure McDonald's there. But you can see this shows you more or less the same picture. Real wages are high along the west, across the north, and then down into the east, and a little bit higher in Florida. Is that Florida? There we are. Can I find it? I can't find the red dot. Yeah. A little bit higher in Florida than the rest of the South. Now let me show you an amazing thing. I'm going to show you 2 amazing things. I'm going to show you another map. The next map is mortality rates, age-adjusted mortality rates by county. Remember, blue here means high. Okay? High wage rates. The mortality won't be the same way. Blue means high. But you'll see they're inversely related. You know the wage, you know whether you're going to die. It's a remarkable finding. There are little isolated spots, but generally speaking, the places I showed you with the low wages, and here, this is the hard South, and that's the places with very high mortality. The low mortality is exactly the place where those real wages are high. Now, I want to show you one more map, and then we'll break. This map I want to show you now, is, to my mind, it's even more remarkable. It's the fraction of the vote that went for the Republican Party by county. You can see it looks almost the same. There are some exceptions up here. There are not very many people there, Wyoming, Utah, and so on. But generally speaking, this area right here, very poor area. Certainly not California, not too much up here, and not much on the east. This is quite remarkable because it's almost the opposite of what you'd think. If you watch what Donald Trump has been doing, it's clearly not doing much to assist this. Incidentally, you may not have heard this. We can ask about it in questions. Someone can ask me if you'd like, what does Donald Trump think about the minimum wage? And I think that we can break at this point. Oh, I wanted to show you that. This is just 2 things. We'll leave it right there. So let's go back. We'll come back, and then I'll show you what the McWages in Chile and the rest of the world and what's happened to growth. Take a break.
Però professor lei si è fermato al punto più interessante, cosa ha fatto?
Però dagli il tempo di mettersi la cuffia, perché sennò...
Dicevo, lei si è fermato al punto più interessante per cosa farà Trump col salario minimo garantito, insomma, con queste cose. Indubbiamente la parte finale è quella.
So you stop at the most interesting point, namely when you asked what does Mr. Trump think about the minimum wage. What you showed us impressed us. Namely, there is a correlation between high mortality rates and low wages. Are there any questions from the floor? Is there anyone wishing to ask a question? We have a prominent representative of the Italian, one of the Italian major trade unions here with us. Maybe she would like to ask a question. Anyway, short questions because we don't have...
Just out of curiosity, why in some graphs the Netherlands was taken out as a point? Thank you.
Oh, okay. the graph I showed you, the only place where the Netherlands, Amsterdam, showed up was in the data for 1914. I do have data for Holland, but it'll look more or less the same as the rest of the Western European countries. So that example was not anything about current information. Oh, I still can hear. Oh, okay, I have to turn.
Se volete pensarci un attimo, vorrei fare una domanda.
So while you think of your questions, I would like to ask a question to Professor Ashley. You showed a diagram or a graph relating to the productivity increase and the reduction of working hours in the second industrial revolution, so between 1890 and 1914, consider that the first industrial revolution took place a century earlier. Currently, we are undertaking a new industrial revolution based on the labor automation. And an alarm has been sent about the loss of jobs that will follow as a consequence. Thanks to Internet of Things and big data, artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and so on and so forth. So there has been a substantial and remarkable speed up in the automation that would steal away jobs or destroy jobs, as was the case years ago, centuries ago, when the Industrial Revolution actually destroyed jobs in the agriculture. So do you think it will be possible to recover the jobs that will be lost thanks to new jobs that will be created by the new technologies? I know it's a bit general question, but maybe you can provide us with some food for thought.
It is a big question. Very big question. But it opens up this discussion which has been going on about whether we're some people think we're in the potential beginning of a great productivity growth, and some people don't. You know, the favorite comment is, in the 19th century we got the steam engine, and in the 21st century we got Facebook. Does Facebook create the productivity of a steam engine? Probably not. So that's Bob Gordon. His view is that productivity growth is slow. I think many economists have changed their views more toward Gordon because productivity growth, measured productivity growth, is very slow. It's not substantial in any country. So although there is concern about robotics, I think it's concern that it somehow is not increasing productivity. I think historically, so there are two things to say about that. First, the productivity growth is not very high. Secondly, the link, and this will be interesting perhaps for the trade unionist, the link, at least in the U.S., between productivity growth and wage growth, which when I was a student was taken for granted, no longer seems to show up in the data. So we now see productivity growth when we do see it, and we still don't see wage growth. I will show you in a little bit data on wage rate at McDonald's, but the last decade has not been good news. And I don't know the answer. It's an open question whether we can find something that will generate productivity growth and do it rapidly enough compared to population growth so that we can actually see increases in real incomes. And now in the U.S., the breaking of the link between productivity growth and wages is identical to, really, the decline in labor share of total income. So we have seen a decline in labor share of total income. I cannot believe it will continue to decline, in which case, if there's productivity growth, then there has to be wage growth. But who's to say?
Ok. Qualche altra domanda? Prego.
Thanks a lot. Very fascinating. In fact, you cut in at the most interesting spot. Basically, my question is there more than a correlation? So is there a real causal link between higher wages and higher mortality? Because, let's say, for my poor understanding of the United States, those are also the most liberal states where there are also maybe more public goods like California, Massachusetts, and so on. So it's more than a just pure link. Do you really find a causal one?
That's a very good question. So many people have been looking at the correlation between mortality and other things. Most measures of social failure are correlated with mortality measures. I think this is a particularly interesting one because it's not identical in any way to mortality. And if you interpret it the way I did, which is, why would there be real wage differences across American counties? Well, it must be because that county is more productive in some sense. And being more productive relies on all those things you mentioned. It relies on infrastructure, everything else. So it may be that the real wage at this level is a measure of total factor productivity at the county level, something you could normally never get. And it may be that that total factor productivity is what's driving the mortality. And that, as you say, the fact if you just raise the wage, it wouldn't by itself do anything. Now, one way, we haven't done this, but one way to test it is to look at whether, there are two ways really. One way would be to look at the correlation where the minimum wage is generally not binding and see whether it's still true that the wage rate is correlated with mortality. Another way to look at it would be to look at the change in the wage and compare it with any changes you see in mortality. Now, it could be the mortality change takes a while and you should look at long wage changes. That's harder to do, but we will see minimum wage increases in many U.S. states. When we collected these data in 2016, we'll now collect again in 2017, and there will have been many minimum wage increases over that period. It's unlikely that it would show up in mortality right away, but if we collect data long enough, we might be able to look at the changes, which I think would be a more convincing exercise. The way I interpret it now, and I think if you want to have a model in your head, just think of a model in which the productivity in producing tradable goods differs across counties, and it's that productivity which is related to everything associated with people living in that county that would make the mortality lower. So the causal direction is not altogether clear. But I think it's probably, at this point, it might be the most independent thing we have that we can correlate with mortality at quite high correlation, by the way. Across counties, the R-square is like 0.3. Because everything else we have is, like suicide rates or something, but those are more or less the same thing as the mortality that you're looking at. But that's a very good question. It's not clear. Even if it is, there's a causal link, it's not clear what the interpretation is.
Bene, vogliamo ascoltare l'ultima parte della...
All right, let's listen to the last part of the presentation. Thank you very much. So let's listen to the last part of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Il Big Mac Index che ho qui.
In the meantime, the Big Mac Index I got here shows that India is 44% cheaper than the United States. Means the rupee is 44% less value than the United States currency.
You missed my point. It will be until productivity grows. Okay, let me show you a few numbers. In other words, the point I was trying to make earlier is that the price of the Big Mac reflects two things: tradable goods, they have to be the same everywhere, and non-tradable goods, which is labor. If labor is cheap, you can do the algebra. If the wage rate in India is, it's probably 30 cents an hour, 40 cents. And if a third of the cost of a Big Mac is labor, then there's going to be a massive difference in price. Just because the domestic good, the untradable factor is so inexpensive. So let me show you a few examples. This is current, 2016 for the USA. The average wage is $10.50. The price of a Big Mac is on average $4.85. So this is kind of a benchmark, 2.16 Big Macs per hour. To give you some idea, generally speaking, is the way to think about it, Big Macs per hour is about 2 in developed countries. So just to show you that that's right, there's Italy. The wage rate is lower, 9.8, but the Big Mac price is lower too. And so you have Big Mac per hour of 2.12, a little bit lower, 2% lower, say, than in the U.S. Very similar. Now let me show you some other countries that are maybe more interesting. There's China. The price, the wage rate for a person who works at McDonald's is $2.20 an hour. But the Big Mac price is half the price, almost half the price, of what it is in the U.S. or China. So Big Macs per hour is 0.84. Nowhere near as high as the U.S. or Italy, maybe a third, maybe a little bit less than a third of what it would be. And China is actually doing very well as developing countries go. Here's Brazil. Many people think of it as the rich country. It's actually a very poor country. Wage rate is $1.31 an hour. Big Macs are very expensive, and Big Mac per hour is about 0.27, very low. I mean, even if you didn't adjust for the Big Mac price, you can see that the wage rate in dollars is almost half what it is in China. That's, by the way, a dramatic change over the last 15 years. There's Chile. I was just in Chile. Chile, the Big Mac price is a very sensible $3.50, but the wage rate is only $2.15 an hour. So they only have Big Macs per hour of 0.61. This is a sad case. This is Venezuela. At the last time we had 2015, we collected the data. Because of the exchange rates control, wage rates were 17 cents an hour. Big Mac price was really cheap, 67 cents. Big Macs per hour was 0.25. That clearly could not last, and now all McDonald's are gone in Venezuela. Let me show you a picture in 2007. I picked this example because 2007 is before the financial crisis. This is when things were going well. And the way I've constructed this index is the first column has there are too many countries. You cannot display 65 countries. So I've made continents, special little continents, and you'll see these are more or less the largest countries. And then I have the rest of Asia. I put Eastern Europe all together, and I put Western Europe all together. Sorry about that. And then the Middle East, where it's extremely difficult to collect data, largely because many of the workers there are not indigenous. They come from abroad, and it's hard to know exactly what that makes. And then there's Latin America, which is probably too big as well. You can see the general level of prices. The U.S. at that time was $7.33. Only Japan was higher. You can see typical China's at 81 cents, and so on. Now, in the second column, I've taken the ratio of the country in question. I'm doing this many times, so you have to pay attention. I've taken the ratio of the country in question to the U.S., just to make it easier to understand. So the Canadian McWage was 93% of the U.S. McWage, close. Russia was 32%, South Africa 23%, China 11%, India 6%, Japan almost exactly the same, rest of Asia 14%, Eastern Europe 25%, Western Europe 29% more than in the U.S., and Latin America 14%. The Big Mac prices in the fourth column, or in the third column, over here, that's in dollars again. And you can see that, as expected, the high-wage countries have higher prices. That's the Bloss-Samuelson effect. The Big Mac is partly tradable and partly non-tradable. So it's not exchange rates that explain these prices. It's the fact that part of the product is made with non-tradable good, and that non-tradable good is labor. And in the right-hand column, you have Big Macs per hour. So you can see the U.S. was at a high of 2.4, Canada 2.2, Russia a little over 1, Western Europe at 2.2, and you can read the rest of these off of here. Now, what I want to show you next, well, there's a picture. I couldn't resist this because this is actually from the internet. So that is an advertisement for McDonald's in China. And that's the advertisement for McDonald's in the U.S. If there's more stereotypical picture, I do not know what it is. And that's how many Big Macs you get in each place. This is a picture that tries to give you an idea of the world distribution of the dollar McWage rate. So what I've done is the wage rate runs along this axis, and then up here is a population ratio, right? So it's the fraction of the world's population. So you can see the fraction of the world's population that's at or below $2.50 an hour is very, very high. So generally speaking, the vast majority of the world, which of course is in India and China, has wage rates that are far below $2.50 an hour. This is my attempt to show you some growth. This is very good news. I was so happy when I first did this. From 2000 to 2007, so you can see what I'm doing. I'm taking 2000 up to before the financial crisis. It's a little bit hard to understand this unless I explain it to you. So the first column shows you the wage rate in the U.S. in 2007 compared to 2000. So 1.13 means that the money wage increased by 13% in the U.S. 50% in Canada. Look at Russia, 460%. China, 92%. India, 57%. Japan, a drop of 5%. Now, what I've done is to take the ratio, and I would take that number and use it as the denominator, and then divide by each of these. So I'm showing you what the growth is like in each of these countries compared to the U.S. So needless to say, the U.S. is 1. The Canadian case, they grew by 34% more than the growth rate. The growth rate there was 34% more than it was in the U.S. The Russian growth rate was 4 times as high as the U.S. growth rate. Chinese one was 70% higher. Indian 40% higher. And the Japanese were dropping by 15%. So I do the same thing with the Big Mac price ratio. So that's the growth in the price of the Big Mac over there. 21% in the U.S. So you can do the comparison yourself. You can see that because the price of a Big Mac went up more than the wage rate, the Big Mac per hour ratio declined. So compared to its level in 2000, the Big Macs per hour went down. The real wage in the U.S. dropped by 7%. The real wage in Canada dropped by 8%. The real wage in Russia went up by 250%. This is the source of Mr. Putin's power. This man has presided over the greatest growth in Russian history. From the point of view of any ordinary Russian, he's a genius. It should never be forgotten. The man has to be anybody who can do that for any country will be incredibly popular. I could not even conceive of the U.S. having a growth rate of 250% in the real wage over less than, say, 100 years. China, 60% faster than the U.S. India, 53%. And Japan, more or less stable. So this is a great period in a way. The poorest countries, Russia, China, and India, grew rapidly. 50% faster growth in China and India, or more than that, than in the U.S. From 2000 to 2007, now the bad news. This is the same analysis from 2007 to 2011. I put more countries in here because I had more countries. You can see the U.S. continues to decline. Canada has now declined. There are only 2 countries on this chart, other than Eastern Europe, small growth. There are only 2 countries that have significant growth, Russia and China. The recession, basically, the way we've adjusted to it everywhere is by reducing wages. Real wages have been in decline. So the part about this that was the most depressing to me is India. which people think of India as a fast-growing country, but actually compared to population growth and in real wage measures, that growth stopped several years ago. And that it is true, of course, that because China is the largest country, that poverty across the world continues to decline. And I showed you, in fact, the wage rate has continued to increase up to 2016. Let me show you a recent picture. Now, it's a little busy. The reason is because there are 4 countries, but there are 2 measures of wage rates for each country. You'll see that some of the measures start here. That's because that's when we started doing it. So these are the countries for which we collect data regionally. And it's Big Macs per hour. So this allows you to compare the difference in the country as a whole with the big city. A good example might be the U.S., which is the gray line. That's for the big cities, the gray line, and you can see the decline. So it's going down, been going down for a long time. Where's my red dot? Yeah. Not as big a decline outside of the big cities. You can see Russia. No matter how you measure it, higher in this measure, no matter how you do it, you can see they have started to decline. But they've had growth for a long time. A little bump there here, but the growth for a long time. China, of course, is much lower, but it has continuous growth. And then there's India, which is basically tanked. So this is really totally up to date. So that's what's happening in the world. I think many people are surprised to see that the Russian real wage could get as high as the U.S. Big shock to most Americans. But it has been a phenomenal growth period for the Russians. And despite the oil price collapse, you don't see any collapse of real wages here. It's a decline, substantial decline, but no collapse. Okay, let me take a few minutes to talk about Blasa-Samuelson. So I mentioned this business about, this is to explain more about why exchange rates can't be expected to adjust these things. So what I've done is to show you on this axis the wage rate, and on this axis the Big Mac price. And you see they go up, but they don't go up linearly. They go up this way. That's the so-called Blasa-Samuelson effect. It implies that real wages are, that labor is about a third of the cost of a Big Mac. This is a very nice picture. I love this picture. This shows you the growth rate in Big Macs per hour compared to the level of the Big Mac per hour in 2009. What does it show? Well, it shows that the high-wage countries have had the lowest growth rates. These two, by the way, the population size is the size of the ball. You can see India and China have done better. So the growth rates, the U.S. has had a substantial decline in real wages, as have many other rich countries. So this is what we would hope to see if there's leveling in the world, if the poor countries are catching up to the rich countries. So it's the growth rate measured against the level in the initial period. I wanted to show you this because I wanted to show you that how it is that PPP is purchasing power parity. I wanted to show you that this is an incredibly cheap way to collect data on GDP. A first cut measure of the gross domestic product can be obtained by just finding out how much somebody makes who works in a McDonald's. Amazingly simple thing. The places that are way off are the ones that have the very high minimum wages, like in here. But generally speaking, that's because they've used the minimum wage to redistribute income, for better or worse. But the point is that, generally speaking, you can use that. This is total factor productivity as measured from the Penn World table versus my measure of total factor productivity based on wage rates at McDonald's adjusted for capital labor ratios, and you can see they're very highly correlated. If you want to know how productive a country is, a simple way to find out is look at how much someone in a McDonald's makes. Doesn't take much work. I want to say one final thing, and then we'll wrap this up. This is a very provocative point I'm going to make. But far and away the cheapest way to make poverty go away is to move people. If you went to Michael Kramer's talk, which was very interesting, you can see that making less developed countries become developed is very, very difficult. It takes a long time. We never know exactly why it happens. There's one way for sure that you can make very poor people richer. Move them to rich countries. A McWage is a job that anybody can do. These are people who are doing the same work in every one of these countries. If they can do it in China, they can do it in the US. They don't need very many words of English, especially now that we're using touchscreens. So a tiny amount of English can get you there. This is a very provocative point because it's basically a pro-argument for migration. To cure the world's poverty, the simplest way to do it would be to move people from the poorest countries to the richest countries. Now, I realize this is extremely provocative because there are many other downsides, but the upsides are simply phenomenal in size. This is work based on migration rates that have actually taken place. Let me show you this picture first. The bottom axis has the difference in wage rates between about 2,000 comparisons. So I compare wage rates, the richer country to the poorer country, across many. You can imagine how many comparisons there are, right? If I have 70 countries, I can compare each one country to all of the other 70. Now I can take the remaining 69, compare them to the rest. So there are many, many comparisons. And these are the actual migration rates up on this axis. You can see the interesting thing is there's no correlation between how much migration there is and what the wage gap is. It isn't the case that migration rates are higher when the wage gap is higher. This suggests that most migration is not, at least in any simple way, totally economically determined. But what it does do is this. It says, suppose I take the observed migration that we've seen and ask how much welfare, how much money, how much GDP was created by those movements. Now here I have a comparison of someone who does exactly the same thing in each country. It's not like better migrants compared to lesser migrants. These are just the same. They're doing exactly the same thing. So I solved the selection problem completely. I'm giving this as kind of an example. I solved the selection problem completely. These are no better or worse men. No selection issues here at all. I can compare people who moved and ask the question of how much money is involved. Well, this is in dollars, right? So you can see if you look, I aggregate the number over here. You can see that the numbers are simply phenomenal. So it's like $4 million an hour that was created by the migration that took place in 2006. $4 or $5 million per hour. If I use more country pairs, it can go up to $9 or $10 million per hour. That's added GDP to the world. Added GDP to the world. It shows you the simplest way of all to make the world more equal is just to move many of the poorest people into the richest countries. The alternative, of course, is to try to create richer countries where people already are. That's slow, and in some cases goes backwards. In any event, this is the provocative pro-migration argument. That's really all I have to say, but I do have a closing slide, and you may, if you like, you may yell out where you think each of these McDonald's is. I think that's China. We know that one. Good guess. Thank you very much.
Purtroppo non c'è il tempo di fare un ulteriore giro di domande.
Unfortunately, we haven't got time for further questions. We have to leave the room. Therefore, I would like to thank wholeheartedly our professor for the fascinating and very unusual presentation. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful day. Thank you very much.